Graph the following function. Show at least 2 cycles. Use the graph to determine the domain and range of the function. We are going to graph the function y equals 6 times the sine of pi over 2x minus 1. We will begin with 1 cycle of the graph of y equals the sine of pi over 2x. We can find where 1 cycle resides by constructing a compound inequality with a lower limit of 0 and an upper limit of 2 pi. Then we will put what's inside the parentheses, pi over 2x, in the center. In order to solve for x, we will multiply all 3 places by 2 over pi. On the left, we still have 0. In the middle, everything except the x cancels. And on the right, the pi's cancel, so we have 2 times 2, or 4. So 1 cycle of the graph of y equals the sine of pi over 2x occurs between 0 and 4. So we will graph the sine function between 0 and 4. The graph of the sine function has x-intercepts at the beginning of the cycle, at the end of the cycle, which we have determined to be 4, and halfway in between those 2 values, which would be 2. It has a peak in the first half of the cycle, which would be 1, and a valley in the second half of the cycle, which would be negative 1. We can now construct 2 cycles of the graph of y equals the sine of pi over 2x by extending our graph another 4 units. So we have 2 cycles of the graph of y equals the sine of pi over 2x between the x values of 0 and 8. Now we can graph 2 cycles of the graph of y equals 6 times the sine of pi over 2x just by using our transformations. We know that when we multiply a function by a value greater than 1, it stretches the graph vertically. Now we can graph 2 cycles of the graph of y equals 6 sine pi over 2x minus 1 by shifting our vertically stretched graph down 1 unit. So the graph in green now is the graph of y equals 6 times the sine of pi over 2x minus 1. The way we have it graphed now is just for 2 cycles between 0 and 8. But the graph of y equals 6 times the sine of pi over 2x minus 1 would actually continue without bound. So the domain for the function y equals 6 times the sine of pi over 2x minus 1 would actually be negative infinity to positive infinity, or all real numbers. The range would be from minus 7 to 5. The amplitude for this function is 6, the period is 4, and the phase shift is 0.